Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our very first Free Press Book Club of 2021. I hope you had a great new year and a healthy and happy holiday season. We're so happy to be back, especially reading Five Wives. So we'll just do our quick round of introductions. Of course, we have our author, Joan Thomas, here. Thank you so much for being here, Joan.
Thank you.
We have books editor Ben Sigurdsson and Chris Hall of McNally Robinson. And we are going to run things as we always do. We'll do our normal announcements at the end of the evening. And I'm just going to throw it right over to Chris to start with our introduction tonight.
Absolutely. Thanks, Erin. It's nice to see Ben's library set up.
It's not even virtual. It's not even a green screen or anything. I can actually pull out a book.
His books aren't organized by color. I thought that was a thing now.
Really, I could pull out Joan's book, the opening chapter.
All right, down to business. So, what an amazing story, and what an incredible and powerful novel Joan Thomas has written, so that we can immerse ourselves in this world and deal with the issues that are contained in there. But how do you read a novel based on real events? If we talked about what really happened, we'd end up talking about the book as if it was nonfiction. Writing a novel is a much different project. Clearly, the facts of the story have to remain, or it would be entirely fictional. But what can the author control when writing such a book? One of the aspects of the story that I found myself being fascinated by was what was happening to my sympathies as I read. The story as it exists in the minds of the original missionaries was pure and positive. They couldn't do any harm in their own minds because they were doing God's work. Subsequent pilgrimages to the historical sites would tell us that that idealism carried on in society's interpretation of the events in Ecuador. But how do we as Manitobans read the book that way when we're learning so much about the damage done to Indigenous peoples here through the good intentions and pure ideals of Christians who set up residential schools? I think for me, that's the split in this heart of this powerful novel. So what is the novel's point of view? Does it stand with the busload of tourists from Georgia who presumably accept the story on the missionaries' terms, or with Cornell and Abby and Fidel, who see the damage done to the Warani and the fact that the missionary work paved the way for the oil companies to move in? We can't have it both ways, says the novel. David and Fidel find it impossible to bridge their differences and find connection. And the novel gives the final word to Abby, someone of a new generation who does see the harm done and challenges the ideal version. But don't take my word for any of this, because we have the opportunity to hear from the author herself. And to get that started, I'll pass the mic over to Joan Thomas, who will get us going by reading a little bit from the novel.
Okay, well, Chris, that was such a lovely setup. I'm so interested in so many of the things you said. I guess I will read rather than jumping into them, but you really, really opened up a lot of windows of thought there, and thank you for that. I always find it hard to know what to read because there are 8 points of view in this novel, and each person's story felt so different to me. But I'm going to read you a little bit from one of the missionary wives' point of view. Her name was Marge Saint, and her husband was the pilot who became obsessed very early on with the desire to take the gospel to these reclusive Indigenous people that they called the Auca. They were actually called the Warani. So Marge and the other wives were faced with a real painful situation given the amount of commitment in that group and given their fears, because nobody had ever had a peaceful contact with this Indigenous group. So the part I'm going to read you has them in the missionary headquarters for a meeting, and Nate is telling them about his first sighting of the Warani people. Marge has high hopes that the whole thing will be derailed in this meeting, but this is what she encounters when Nate starts talking. Nate is the one who opens the meeting, standing tall against the turquoise cupboards, wearing jeans and the white shirt that is such a beast to iron. She was up until 11. Her golden-haired husband, flushed with excitement and glowing with that special light the priest remarked on. He's not nervous. He doesn't know what it is to be nervous, but he is sober with his new role. She's never known him to try to sway people with words, Facts, yes. Words, no. Normally, he uses words like a technician, like a man accustomed to the shortwave radio. But to her surprise, he starts his story early in the morning, taking them into his day, recounting all the judgment calls he has to make, what it is to be constantly monitoring cargo weight, fuel, time, the radio, the wind, the clouds. He takes them into a landing, coming in low over the trees, avoiding the chickens and the children that wander onto the airstrip, dodging potholes, responding to the Indians who crowd around the plane, ministering to the missionaries who haven't seen another white guy in weeks. And then flying home with a bit of extra fuel in his tank and making the discovery. He paints the picture with incredible vividness, a keyhole opening in the clouds, light streaming through like in the rapture, and people on the paths between the houses, hearing the plane lifting their heads in the sudden light and shadow, women, men, children. How did he know they weren't Quechua? They were naked as jaybirds, he says, and the hush in the room is broken by excited laughter. He speaks over them with evident emotion. Lots of days I feel close to the Lord when I fly, but that day I literally saw his hand. I saw God reach down and open the clouds with a finger. Look, our Lord was saying, these are lost souls whom I love and gave my son to save. Nothing is as moving as the heartfelt eloquence of a man not usually given to words. They're all silent then, and in the silence, Marge senses something like awe. Surely the presence of the Lord is in this place. Nate gives that silence its due, and then he speaks again. He's been doing daily reconnaissance over the Kururai River. He's found a long playa not far from the Alka settlement. He's not keen to land on sand, but he's done it before in a pinch. They'll prefab a platform in Air Huno and fly it in and hoist it up onto the trees by ropes. That's where they'll sleep, so they'll have a vantage point and can't be ambushed. He'll fly supplies in every morning, and then they'll wait and pray. He keeps talking, and Marge understands. This is not a meeting to discuss the risks and vote yes or no. This is a meeting to brief the girls. The plan is glorious and complete. It's an extravagant bird in full flight. A treehouse features prominently in it, and code. The men have been hatching it for weeks, standing in the shade of the airplane on jungle airstrips, heads together, working out the details of a ground mission, not just gift drops the way Nate promised. He keeps talking, and she looks around the room at the women she counted on to speak up and sees carefully guarded expressions. He keeps talking, and she understands that he's far ahead of her, that she's a baby in treachery compared with him. While her days were taken up with scheming, he was cementing his plans. Look at me, Nate, she breathes, and he does. His eyes straight on hers, a high red flush around them, and she reads in them what only she can read. It's not what she thought. It's not, this will teach you that you can't undermine me. It's this. Please, Margie, please give me this.
That's a lovely, lovely passage to have chosen. So a great way to sort of jump into this. I'm really just going to try and, I have a few questions that I've sort of pulled together myself, but we also had tons of reader questions and lots of good ones. I think last time we spoke would have been the day that you were awarded, or it was announced that you won the Governor General's Award. And so congratulations again. Well, that was late 2019. Mm-hmm. What's it like sort of to come back to this book, over a year later and sort of dive into it again and start thinking about it again?
Well, I think more than any of my other novels, my thinking about this book has kind of evolved through the last year. And that is largely because I've had such incredible conversations with readers. It's been just amazing to me. I've had, I kind of expected that people who didn't know this story and didn't have the same religious background that I had might find it a little bit, there's an awful lot of talk about religion in it, and they might balk at that. Or I expected that people that did know this story might really question my audacity in going into it. But in fact, I found both groups just brought so much interesting thinking to it. And I think, things have happened this year. If you think of the politics in the States, for example, and the role the evangelical church has played in it. And I think that for me, that has sort of moved my thinking, strengthened my sense of the importance of the politics of this book in a way, the way it kind of shows people in ideological bubbles and how they write their own narratives about reality. And it kind of, it takes you into that kind of thinking. And I feel like it was more timely probably than I imagined when I started writing it.
Yeah, I get that impression. I mean, you think about sort of the events of the last year or so, and you think about the rise of some fanaticism, some of which is sort of is religious in its sort of initial where it comes from or whatever its origins. But it really sort of does give you a sense, like going back and reading it for this, a year after or so after we had spoken, and with so much that has changed in the world, it really did sort of give me a different perspective on the evangelical way of thinking, and just sort of the approach to this sort of going to Ecuador and the attempt to sort of to convert these people, or to bring them into the faith or whatever. It was quite fascinating.
Well, I was interested that Chris raised the whole question of, my relationship as, a settler in Manitoba on Indigenous lands, and how, in a sense, I feel as if I did choose to explore some of those issues through a missionary enterprise that actually took place thousands of miles away. The last year and the conversations I've had have made me more aware of how an upbringing where you have visiting missionaries talking to you all the time about Indigenous peoples in different countries, and describing them as heathen and in need of saving, how that has impacted our culture in terms of a lack of respect for Indigenous spirituality. And I'm just more cognizant of that, I think I was, even then when I wrote the book, just because of the conversations I've had.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So we had a lot of questions about various aspects of researching this type of book. I mean, it must have been such a massive undertaking, and not only to research the facts, but also to then imbue the fiction and the what is the internal dialogue or monologues or whatever of the characters. What was the process like for you of researching this book? I mean, was it a longer process than some of your other books? It seems like it just is just so ripe with detail and fine descriptions and stuff that it must have been quite the undertaking.
Well, I'm gonna, if we have listeners who are writers right now, I'm going to let you in on my point of view with respect to research. And that is that it's a heck of a lot easier to write a book from research than to make everything up. I find it a very rich experience. It just furnishes your imagination. And, right, the opening sky was all invented, and the book I'm writing right now is contemporary and it's all invented. And I think it's harder, to be honest. And I guess the other thing I'll say that made this not so hard is that I grew up with this story. So people find all the characters challenging when they come into it. And people are saying you should have had a chart of all these couples. And I think that's good feedback. I knew these couples. I knew their names. Anybody who grew up in a church like I did viewed them kind of as heroes and martyrs, and they were well known. So I came with a certain base of understanding. I had read Elizabeth Elliot's books when I was young, but for researching this, there's like a ton of memoirs and biographies about these particular figures. So I read those, and I read other works about Ecuador from the missionary perspective, and then I kind of moved to the secular perspective, and that became really interesting, because there are anthropology books like Wade Davis, who lived with the Waorani people for a while. So I did a fair amount of reading before I went to Ecuador, and then I went to Ecuador twice and visited the headquarters where the Nate family had lived. I went to Shandia where the Elliott family lived, and went into a rainforest lodge, well, twice actually. And that was really a fantastic experience, and terribly important to somebody from the Canadian prairies, just to try and capture some detail. I think a lot of the detail in the novel is thanks to the guides I had in those rainforest lodges, actually.
That's fantastic. I mean, it's interesting to say that you think it's easier to work from a historical, real event perspective and sort of work out from there versus sort of creating an entire world, where it would seem to me like, when you have that kind of flexibility, you can bend and move and shape things the ways that you want. Whereas with this, you'd be actually sort of stuck within some parameters.
Oh, sure.
I mean, obviously, with the younger generations of the children and stuff, you fictionalize them and injected fiction in that capacity. So,
well, you could say I'm stuck within certain parameters, or you could say I was given a fantastic infrastructure to build on, which is the way I saw it. And there's a lot of room, because when I read the missionary memoirs, they all use the same kind of language and rhetoric, that God led me to do this. Well, as a novelist, then I'm saying, how would I understand that in emotional and psychological terms? And so, I felt like I had a lot of freedom, like the facts are the least of it. Maybe I could put it that way.
Yeah.
What is more fascinating to me is just the emotional texture of the experience, and that part I got to write. So,
yeah, I mean, the fear I would imagine would be, there are still relatives or descendants of these people who are living. Obviously, the younger ones not portrayed in this book, but there are you don't want to get the facts wrong, I guess.
Yeah.
In such a detailed and richly textured book, I commend you for for getting all of it, to at least to my knowledge, right? Chris, did you want to jump in with anything? Or
I was curious, Joan. You say in your in the author's note that you discovered this story, I guess, as a child, and so in many ways you've been writing this novel for a long time. So, and I was kind of alluding to the fact that as a society, that this story will have changed in what we assume and what were our values and so on. Has that been the case for you personally in this story? Like, has it changed for you?
My understanding of it has changed.
Well, or your sympathies, or your...
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, in the research, I discovered lots of facts that Elizabeth Elliot was selective in what she wrote about, because she was shaping this story according to her beliefs, and they saw it as a real recruiting tool for missions. And also, she didn't know. There's lots she didn't know, because she wrote her first book in the year after her husband died. And so there's a lot that's come to light since then, about the fact, for example, that the missionaries shot fatally wounded a Waorani man. And that's something that people who have revered this story for a long time find really hard to accept, because it never appears in the missionary writing. Or the competition between this group of missionaries and Rachel Saint, and the fact that they probably helped themselves to her language notes, and the recklessness of their going in the way they did. So on one level, of course, in my research, I found out things I didn't know, but even if I hadn't, I guess my intention in writing was more to question the whole premise of the mission. So,
have you heard from any of the families that were involved? Have they?
No, not directly, and I'm not sure how aware they are of the book. Five Wives has been quietly released in the US. Like, there hasn't been a lot of publicity, because HarperCollins just released the Canadian edition there. So I'm not sure how aware they are, but the grandson of Nate Saint, Jamie Saint, is still a missionary working in Ecuador, and came to speak to a church in Winnipeg last year. And I know that people sort of talked to him about my book and may even have given him a copy. I'm not sure. And he apparently, I heard a lot of reports about this session. He apparently said from the pulpit, I understand that a Winnipeg writer has seen fit to write the story of my family. And he said, I haven't read her book, but I can summarize it in one word: fiction.
Well,
which I can't argue with.
that's where you in McNally Robinson in the fiction section, right?
Yeah. But of course, I mean, this whole experience has really made me reflect a lot on where truth lies, because I would stand pretty strongly by many elements in my book as opposed to some of the memoirs that I read. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably looking back with some context and some distance and some, further knowledge of all the events that took place, there are probably, a great many fictions, in some of those accounts too, right? Or at least a perspective that only sort of comes at it from one side.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in terms of pulling this book together, you mentioned 8 narrative threads. I mean, did you find you sort of, as you were pulling it together, I just sort of like how to make the sausage kind of question, but did you find you sort of went down one path and then when you got stuck, you could sort of jump over to someone else, or you just sort of you got onto one narrative thread and you just sort of for as long as you could?
Well, they're all separate in this book, so it's kind of like there's almost like 6 novellas in a way, and they move chronologically through the story. So somebody is passing the baton of the narrative forward. And I didn't really want to write it that way initially. I wanted to weave the points of view, but I couldn't seem to make it work. And it actually rather nicely worked out that Olive's story was about, them being recruited, and Rachel's was about them being inspired, and Marge's was about them starting the mission, and so on. It seemed to take shape nicely that way, even though it wasn't what I had intended initially. And I mean, the title would suggest that I will follow the 5 wives, but I actually bring in other points of view just because I needed a more distant or neutral or secular perspective. And so one of these novellas is the Life magazine photographer that came
Cornell.
in.
That was just a fascinating thread to insert and sort of help weave sort of those narrative threads together. I thought that was fantastic.
He was a great outsider.
Sorry?
He was a great outsider.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I was taken by him as a personality, partly because he had this brother who was like these larger than life adventurers, kind of like the missionary men. And then he had lost his brother and he was grieving. And so once I read about him, I could hardly walk away from him as a narrator.
Was that narrative thread sort of like a bit of a relief, like a little release of tension, like where you could sort of step a little bit away from the wives and the missionaries and sort of like give this exterior perspective? For sure.
Yeah. I mean, the story is building to a climax, and then all of a sudden you're in Manhattan in a bar with Cornell at night. And I know it was that. And it also was a way of telling the really horrific story of the killing from a bit of a tangential way, rather than entering it very head on.
Well, let me just take a quick look through some of these reader questions, which are fantastic. There was a few that dealt with the research aspect. Let's see. After writing this, Marguerite Boisvert says, after writing this amazing book, what can you say was the greatest life lesson you got from it? And were you turned off from the way they listened to their religion? I guess maybe, you come from obviously these books were in your formative years. You come from a somewhat religious background. And, this is me sort of paraphrasing the question now. But so.
Well, maybe I will. Maybe the life lesson that I'll talk about is just how moved I was when I thought about the indoctrination of children. It's kind of a thread through this book because the missionaries all have children, and they were all raised, except for Roger Youderian, they were all raised in very fervently religious homes. And so as I was writing it, I guess I became aware of how hard it is to move beyond those kind of blinders. I mean, there's such an internal logic to it. And I felt a fair degree of sympathy, because it's difficult when you feel so much cognitive dissonance, like the world is so at odds with everything you believe, and yet your whole world is tied up in that. So I guess, I mean, I knew those kinds of things, but I felt them more sharply when I wrote the book, especially with respect to the next generation. I mean, adults maybe can, I don't know, distance themselves in a certain way from beliefs about, burning in hell forever or the coming of Christ. But when you tell these kinds of doctrines to small children, they're very literal. So I was moved by that as I wrote.
One character that a couple people asked about is Rachel, or one person, I guess, because she's a real life person. Suzanne said, Rachel's a puzzle to me. Why is there such jealousy / animosity between her and her brother Nate? And then another person asked about Rachel as well. How do you personally feel about Rachel? And Elaine Bradley, she said, I'm left with such frustration and such pity.
Yeah, I had a lot of feelings about her too. I feel that I didn't want to caricature the missionaries, and I feel I did verge a little bit into that territory with Jim Elliot to some extent, and with Rachel. And on the other hand, it was, well, no, maybe I should just talk first about my sympathy for her. The details that I give about her childhood are largely true. She was left with this huge responsibility, and she talked with a lot of bravado about how harshly she disciplined her brothers. And when I saw how coldly Nate treated her, by their own account, the way that she was just quite cruelly shut out of all of the secrets around this mission, even though she was probably more qualified than anybody else, I thought those two things are connected. The way he was treated as a child is connected to the way he treated her as an adult. I felt sympathy for her because there was not a lot of respect for single women missionaries in the world that I grew up in. It was kind of like something you did if you didn't manage to get married, and women who were not allowed to speak in church in North America were expected to live in situations of extreme hardship. So I felt sympathy for her. But on the other hand, she was the person who most strenuously embodied, I would say, a contempt for Indigenous people, a harshness towards them, an absolute indifference to learning about their beliefs. She was the one who facilitated the entrance of the oil companies. And so, if one of my readers is left with many mixed feelings, I would say that probably reflects the way I felt too as I read about her.
Mission accomplished. Chris, you want to jump in with anything? Or?
Well, Elaine Bradley also mentions Barb Udarian. She's a bit of a silence in the book. Is there a reason we don't know a lot about her, I guess?
It's true. And Mary Lou McCullough didn't have her own section either. If I had done the Five Wives, I would have treated them. And I really, what I read about them, I've had a lot of regard and respect for both of them, but I didn't feel as if their story and their experience would have brought a new element to the novel. And so that's why I passed over it.
Was it just that there wasn't enough sort of known about them?
Well, that's a good point, because everybody else has biographies about them, and neither of those two do. So you're right. Maybe if I'd had biographies or memoirs, I would have seen more different and interesting material there. But yeah.
Curious about the author note. It's really an author explanation. Were you compelled to do that yourself, or was that something the publisher or editor was looking for, or what?
No, they didn't ask me to do it. I did it. I wanted to articulate what was fact and what was fiction, I would say, was my main purpose. I think this is a book that leaves a large burden of meaning on the reader. And I'm interested that you kind of said, where is the author? What does she think about these things? And I guess I wanted just to clarify a few things around that. Yeah, I guess it is an explanation to some extent.
Well, I
Well,
think
some of the power of the book comes from us not, there's not a center there for us to
Mhm,
you know,
mhm.
a straightforward center. At least I came in expecting to be much more annoyed by the missionaries, because I'm just hardwired to not to think against that, I guess.
Mhm.
And I wasn't. You made them people, and that's very interesting.
Well, having grown up in that world, I didn't have the luxury of thinking that they're profoundly different from me, you know? So,
yeah, no, absolutely, and I totally thought the same thing, Chris. I was sort of on the same page on that. Trying to think of what other questions I might have. If you want, Chris, if you want to jump in here, if you had anything off the top of your head. I was just looking at the reader questions again. Oh boy, yeah. There's some questions I think you'd have to be able to speak to the actual the missionaries to sort of to get the answers. But we did have a question from Judy talking about Judy Schumer talking about the wide range of times and places where these stories take place. Talks about the research bit. With regards to Five Wives, I've become aware in recent years about the damage caused to Indigenous populations by foreign, including Canadian, resource companies. Indigenous peoples have been forcibly removed from their ancestral lands and have suffered serious health problems from the pollution of their water supply. This viewpoint probably affected my attitude towards the characters of this book, though I kept reminding myself that the story was taking place in the 1950s when our beliefs were much different. That's a very interesting point. I mean, as Canadians coming to this book, from all the histories that we have of, our settlers, relationships with Indigenous people, with land claims, with and the whole climate issue and what have you. This book seems more pertinent and relevant to the Canadian experience than ever, I think, and maybe it gives a nice sort of perspective from Ecuador into our own way of life.
and it's kind of 100 years later, sort of
Mhm.
more recent. Yeah, but I'm really interested that reader raised the whole issue of the resource exploitation in Ecuador, because as you know from the author's note, that was what drew me back to this story, really, was learning about the way this pristine rainforest, the terrible atrocity that had been committed there by Shell Oil and leaving all these open tar pits. And I guess what moves me now is that the Waorani people are probably the most active voice in fighting against the oil companies. They won a huge court battle last summer to protect 500,000 acres of their ancestral lands from further exploration. And they used the exact clause of international law that Indigenous nations in Canada are using, and that is that they weren't properly consulted. And their leader is a wonderful young woman named Namonti Nankimo. If readers are interested, they might want to check out, there's NGOs like Amazon Frontlines that trace the work of the Waorani people in protecting the rainforest. And I have to say that this just moves me away, or blows me away rather, because if we think about how the missionaries had this ideology that they were going to save the Indigenous people in the Amazon, in a certain sense, now we see the Indigenous people fighting hard for the Amazon, which is so integral to our survival on the planet. So I'm very, very moved by Waorani activism in Ecuador right now. And also, I guess the thing people might want to think about is the pandemic, because it's been very difficult in South America, in Brazil, probably more so than Ecuador, but there's still a handful of elders in the Waorani nation that remember the pre-contact days. They remember before the missionaries came. And so they've been very threatened by COVID-19. And I've been following that on these websites as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I just had a text sent to me from Aaron. I got questions here. I got questions here.
Okay.
But which if I'm not looking at you while you're talking, it's
Yeah.
not. I'm just feeling a bunch of questions. Someone asked what age you were when you started questioning the goodness of quote unquote, of missionaries. Like, was it something, I guess, earlier on in life where you sort of, or I guess maybe even in questions of faith in general, growing up, in a semi-religious household and stuff, like were there questions that started arising at a young age for you?
Yeah, I think I kind of lived on two planes, like the plane that was pleasing my parents and operating the way I was expected to operate, and then the more submerged questions. It was important to me to write this fictional character of Abby because I wanted to trace what some of that is like emotionally, to be part of a very loving family and a loving community, and to understand the pain that is caused to families if you choose to move away from everything they see as good to what they see as darkness. And I think my choice was probably delayed for so long because of family factors that when it finally happened, it was like, just, all right, I can take on the world.
Mm-hmm.
It was a relief more than a personal, painful loss of faith. It was an acknowledgement of reality for me. So that would have been when I was in university. Yeah.
Okay. And you talked about you're working on we'll circle back to Five Wives, or Chris, do you want to jump in with anything before I sort of like, because I'm always interested in hearing about what people are working on and talking about, you mentioned the pandemic, like I'm interested in sort of what the pandemic has been like for you, but let's talk a little bit more about the book first.
Well, I was struck, I think you make reference to it in the note again, but that you didn't want to speak for the Wairani. They don't have a significant kind of section, I guess, but although we hear from them a little bit, but could you speak about that?
Yeah. Well, some authors talk about, there's a pressure not to appropriate voices. And I guess I prefer to think of it in terms of narrative sovereignty, that the Wairani people, their sovereignty in almost every respect was invaded, compromised. And I really felt it was very clear to me, I felt absolutely inadequate to write from the point of view of a Wairani person. And I felt that it would be it would be sort of against their own narrative sovereignty. So a lot is known about Dayuma, a character in the book. There's a lot of backstory there that's very fascinating. And I, at one time, had it, not so much from her point of view, but as she told it onto a tape. And I ended up taking that out too. I just thought, I think people could rightly say, why do we need another book by a white person about these white missionaries? And I think that's a valid point of view. I would say it's probably more important to hear the Wairani point of view, but I just wasn't going to be the one that writes it. So, yeah.
Well, yeah, I feel like there would be even more sort of difficult feedback, let's call it, if you wrote the book from the perspective of the Wairani people, or not only exclusively, but even including their voices. I feel like this was the most respectful and sort of not sensible, but just the way about which, if you want to tell this story, I feel like it was the best way to go about doing it, I think.
And I feel as though it is my story in a way, just given all the hours I spent listening to missionary presentations as a young person.
Oh yeah, no kidding. And okay, well, maybe now I'll just poke at what you're doing now. Well, how have you found the pandemic, generally speaking? I mean, in terms of your writerly output, in terms of your just frame of mind, way of life, and maybe is there anything, I don't know, is there anything to be gleaned or whatever from Five Wives that maybe, other than taking the time away from all of this to read it that could be gleaned during the pandemic?
I don't know about that latter question. I would say for many writers, we live pandemic lives all the time. You know, we're pretty, my daily life hasn't changed that much, although the last year I would have traveled a lot because I sort of post Governor General's word, I had a lot of invitations and they all fell through or they went virtual, which is not a bad thing in a certain respect because I was quite worried about my carbon footprint. And I think we're finding new ways to do author events rather than flying across the country. So, but that part of it was disappointing for sure. But I'm writing pretty hard, but when I'm writing, in normal times, I write every day, so it's not different during the pandemic.
And you're able to concentrate?
Oh, yeah. I don't know this whole thing about disciplining yourself. That doesn't factor in for me. It's kind of what I want to do, so.
And you said you're exploring another completely invented fiction, for lack of a better term, not based in historical or anything like that. And would you have started this project, just generally speaking? Without, I don't want to. I'm always afraid I'm going to jinx it when I'm talking to a writer about something they're working on, because so often they're like, "Well, I don't know, I was working on something and then I just trashed it or whatever."
Because Ben asked me a question.
No details required, but just sort of, like generally.
I won't tell you anything I don't want to tell you. So.
I would expect you to.
Yeah, I mean, I started, as soon as all the travel for Five Wives died down, I started. So I have about 200 pages. I've been working for maybe a year and a half, and it's contemporary, 4 characters taking on the contemporary problems of the world.
and for your own sort of. Did you find shifting back to that type of writing to be a relief, or just something and just a sort of a welcome home after doing something like Five Wives? Or
no, I wouldn't say so. I felt really like an expert with these characters, and now I'm an amateur again. By the time you write a book, you get to the end of a 400-page book, you do feel so in that world, and so it's more, it's hard to, I find the beginning of novels very hard. It's hard to develop that intimacy, and I feel like it's only really just coming to me now as I'm at about page 200. So.
Are you a fairly linear writer? Like you sort of go beginning to end, or you have an idea and you're like, I need to write this now?
If I have an idea that's further on, I drop it into a file. But no, the bulk of my focused work is linear.
Just curious. That's sort of like the nuts and bolts again. I'm always curious in terms of how people work. Some people say they can jump around, and some people, they storyboard and all this kind of stuff. But
yeah.
Anyway.
Well, they're big. Novels are big. They're hard to hold everything in your head.
Yeah, I see Erin is back.
Yes, I came back a little early. I thought you were winding down, but then you just kept going. So if you'd like to keep going, by all means.
Yeah, we can keep chatting. Have you ever written short fiction?
No, well, a little bit. I have maybe 2 or 3 short stories published, but it's unusual. I have a collection of short fiction that I never did send out, so I have maybe 8 or 10 there. But they're kind of apprentice work. And once I started with the novel, I just love the huge mural that a novel is. Short stories don't interest me as much because of that. Yeah.
The finished version of Five Wives, would that be essentially like that's about the length that you submitted it, or do you end up chopping a lot off or writing a lot extra? Or
I probably threw out more with this novel than I have with others because of taking out Dayuma's story. And I also had 30 pages about Rachel Saint at the hacienda when she was learning language from Dayuma. I was very interested in that. But I mean, this was a very big subject. It could have gone in so many different directions. I had to make some hard choices. And then with Abby too, I wrote so much about that because I was so interested in that process of her coming to terms with the faith of her family. And my agent didn't like it. My editor didn't like it. My editor said, you got 50 pages here, cut it down to these 3 scenes. And I think she was right. I think it was good advice. So I did, in the editing process, take out maybe 20 pages there, or 30. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought the passages between Abby and David were just lovely. I just thought they were so fantastic. That father-daughter sort of relationship. Maybe I'm projecting a little bit or something, but you know, the sort of you don't always sort of see eye to eye, but and the conflicts that arise and stuff. So.
Well, I really wanted to bring this story into the present day and show how David, who carries this huge legacy, you know, how he negotiates that with the shifting perspective in contemporary times. It was really important to me to have that frame to the whole story. So.
You all done then?
I don't know. Chris, do you have anything else you wanted to
well, I was just going to add to that. I really like the scene when Fidel, or the section, I guess, when Fidel comes along, because I thought the Fidel and David scenes and the fact that they couldn't make a connection was really profound.
Yeah, that drive to in the vehicle or whatever, where there's just like this overriding tension was so fantastic. It was so fascinating, and it was just it was almost sort of painful to be there because you wanted them to connect so badly, but at the same time I couldn't stop reading it. It was just fantastic.
Well, Chris, you said that this is kind of a book with no center, in that where's the author's center? Did you center that to some extent in Fidel? Did you say, okay, here's what the author is thinking?
It's funny because it was at the end that the novel kind of became centered for me, and it was Fidel and Abby that really did that for me. Yeah.
Like I worried that was too on the nose. I was kind of explaining everything, but I kind of thought maybe people need a little bit of that.
No, yeah, I agree with Chris entirely. I think it was great to have a voice come in and just sort of just really say what
what happened. Yeah.
Exactly, and you know, to the extent that we know the real story of what happened, you know, you're sort of thinking those things, and you're like, someone's just got to come out with it or whatever. So it was a great place to do it, and it was just another good way of sort of releasing yet ratcheting up the tension sort of simultaneously, because it's like, oh, finally someone's saying it, but at the same time they're not really having much of a deep connection or a dialogue that you want them to have. So
Dave can't move, really.
Yeah.
It also brought it into the present day, as you said, but it also brought it into the new generations too. So I thought that was effective too.
Absolutely agree.
Yeah. Like Abby has so much more freedom than Dave does. Right. He's kind of this transition figure between the two worlds in a way. Yeah. As a minister, for one thing, he's so invested in.
Whereas Abby can't avoid the damage that has been done, and what has really happened here, and it's clear for her to see, so she has to reckon with it.
Well, I wanted to just say how much I appreciate the invisible readers who are listening to this. It's been fantastic to have conversations with readers throughout this last year. And if you had questions and we didn't really answer them, you can contact me through my website. I enjoy that, actually, to have some dialogue. So there is contact information on my website.
You can't see it, but the chat is very, very active tonight. So I would encourage you tomorrow when it reloads, you can go through and read all the comments in the live chat. Yeah.
And there are some, obviously, the fantastic book club questions that are right on your website too, joanthomas.ca, which, you know, I think offer just as much a chance for people who have read the book to sort of reflect on it as it is, you know, it's as good an opportunity as it is sort of coming at you with questions from them too. So, you know, I think in some ways it's equally or almost as enriching, I think. So kudos to that.
Great.
Well,
Well, you guys, thank you so much for this
Oh,
and for doing
you
just
so
for
much.
doing the whole series. It's fantastic.
Just an absolute pleasure to talk to you. I always enjoy talking to you, and Chris, always good to see you as well. I look forward to seeing you in the flesh in the store very soon.
Thanks
Aaron,
for the great book
Intriguing.
section.
all the time.
Excellent.
All of Canada is proud of the Free Press book section and of McNally Robinson. We're pretty lucky in both.
A good combination.
Yeah.
Just before we go, of course, thank you so much, Joan, for your time. Thank you, Chris and Ben, as always, for moderating this discussion and moving it along. And of course, to all of our readers for, again, I know we've been saying it a lot, but you guys really do come through with these questions. They are like very thoughtful, very thorough, and like really excellent. So thank you so much to everyone who sends in their questions. We already announced our February book club pick, but in case you missed the email or both the emails, I guess, we are going to be reading Oh, Ben has it ready. Songs for the End of the World by Salima. Is it Nawaz or Nawaz?
Nawaz.
Nawaz. Thank you. So this is a book about a pandemic, and Ben and I kind of went back and forth multiple times about choosing a book about a pandemic while we are all very deep within a pandemic. But ultimately, we kind of decided to just lean into it, and it is fiction, but freakishly accurate, maybe.
Yeah, it was written like over the course of about 6 years before the pandemic, between about 2013 and 2019. And Salima, full disclosure, she's based in Montreal, but she did spend some time here. She did her master's degree in English at the U of M at the same time that I did. So I got to know Salima there, and is just a great writer. And yeah, this book was slated to come out in August of 2020. And when the pandemic hit, they pushed out the ebook in April because they just figured, it's so timely. And I think even if there wasn't a pandemic right now, it's got some like a great like wide cast of characters and a real hopefulness to it that I think maybe some people might find helpful. It's quite a lovely book.
Yes, and so we're super excited to have Salima join us next month. I just want to make a note that normally our meeting is on Monday, but next month we are doing it on a Tuesday to accommodate Salima's other commitments. So February 23rd, Tuesday, that is our next meeting, and all of this information will be in an email that you are going to get tomorrow morning if you are registered to our mailing list. That is it for tonight, but thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you again to Joan and Chris and Ben, and we will see you all again next month.
Thank you.
Thank you.